Good morning, Etienne, and welcome.
Hi, good morning, Loa. How are you?
I am so good. So, Etienne, I think we'll start with a full disclosure because you and I have worked together before in FSC when you were Chief Marketing Officer for FSC US. And since then, you've moved on. So couldn't you just start by saying, what are you doing now? What are you doing with Brands for Good?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for having me here today. It's great to be in conversation with you again. So I am working right now leading Brands for Good. And Brands for Good exists under the mothership of Sustainable Brands. Actually, Brands for Good was something that global CMOs approached us about and asked us if we would convene and if we would create a platform for brands to work together. Every year we have a CMO summit and we allow select CMOs to get together. They speak under Chatham House rules. And they get to share with one another their successes and the challenges that they're having. And after one of these meetings about 2 years ago, the CMOs turned to our CEO and asked her, one, we need more spaces like this to meet and more chances to talk. And secondly, we think we can do more than just talk. They realized that they were each in isolation working on driving consumer behavior change within their own business, but that if they collaborated together, perhaps their progress could be accelerated and change could happen faster. And so Brands for Good was born. And as of today, we have many brands. We've been going for about 18 months now. We have Target, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble, Nestle, Visa, Tetra Pak from Europe, CVS, General Mills, Bumblebee Foods, HP Graphics, and Johnson & Johnson. And we're seeing more and more brands joining. It's been really busy for us this year. Everyone is working together to develop shared marketing tools that can measure their progress against driving the 9 most sustainable behaviors that consumers and brands can take together.
Very interesting. I know you also do some research and some polling. Could you tell us some of the latest insights you have from that?
Yes, and that was fascinating just listening to what Solly was saying too. So I'm just going to give a couple of highlights here, but for anyone listening in today that would like a deeper dive or to know more, this is publicly available data and it's available at www.sbbrandsforgood.com. We just conducted research within the US. We did a very broad consumer study with 3,700 people looking at mainstream consumers, looking across the geography. And honestly, when we got the research results back, this was before the election in the US, and it gave some of us goosebumps and it gave some of us hope. So please do go on and find those research results online. I don't know that I'll be able to give you all the goosebumps, but I can give you the highlights. One of the things that was heartening in the US, where we are seeing so much division and so many stories of how divided we are as a nation, was no statistical difference between liberals and conservatives when it came to their attitudes to and their indication to want to help both people and planet. And so we're really not as far apart on this one topic, at least, as we maybe perhaps believed we were. And so that was really encouraging to us. We also saw, and this, Loa, you remember the research that we did 10 years ago now. We started in the US and then we did global research with Futera, with Solly. And that is what led to the global campaign, The Forest for All Forever. But that global research that we did, I was so disappointed at the time to see the disconnect between people's understanding of environmental issues and challenges that we faced and the social aspect too. And so here we are a decade later, lots of hard work later, and most of us in different jobs. And we've done this research, and now we see that 76% of mainstream US consumers believe that the social and environmental challenges we face both need to be solved together. They are inextricably linked, and that you cannot achieve your goals on one without also addressing the other. That was a massive breakthrough moment for us to realize that mainstreamers really are there. And I think, especially in the US, moments like Black Lives Matter, the televised murder of George Floyd, the way that COVID is taking certain segments of society in a much tragic way than others. I think all of these things are contributing to magnify to people the fragments that we have, and for them to understand that the social issues really need to be addressed just as quickly as the climate and environmental ones. So that was great there. The other thing that we saw was we measured, we're looking, one of the key metrics we're using to measure our own success as a collaboration of brands is looking at closing the intention action gap. So consumers almost always report in this percentile that they intend to do the right thing. And then we always see it drop into the 30th percentile that when it actually comes to their shopping actions. And we saw the biggest gaps in intent and action around those social things. So anything that we're doing to build resilient and inclusive societies, to support women and girls, support historically marginalized communities, brands have an opportunity to do more in this space and to help consumers see how they can take action in this space too. And then lastly, one thing I'll say, which I think ties in with what we Dolly too, we didn't go in with a preconceived segmentation of consumers. We really want to do this large study and then get granular and gritty in the DC, what the different groups might be within there. And folks who describe us as not being sustainably minded, as believing that sustainable behaviors and actions are important to them, we still saw them adopting many of the 9 most impactful behaviors. A specific example, non-believers or non-intenders, if you will, 1 in 3 of them are adopting a more plant-based diet right now. So even if you're not in it for the environmental reasons or the social reasons, we're seeing now that these challenges have mainstreamed enough and are woven through our culture enough that we have folks who are adopting the behaviors, even without necessarily having the values, sharing the values that we in this community, in the sustainability community, might have. So that was really encouraging.
That's also hugely interesting. I'm thinking all of this ties very much into both Sully's points, which you've heard, because you understand when she speaks English and you haven't understood a word the rest of the day when we've been speaking in Danish.
I had no idea what you said about me at the beginning. I hope it was all good.
It was kind words, these kind of words, yeah. But it also taps into everything we've heard throughout today. And I'm wondering if I'm out there, imagine a lot of people in the audience, they're small and medium-sized companies, they're really wanting to tap into all of this and really wanting to move on all of this. What would be part of your specific advice to what could they do? How can they tap into these trends? How can they tap into these much more knowledgeable, much more change-ready consumers?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I don't know that I have all of the answers. Obviously, I can give you the ones that are part of my hypothesis. I think it doesn't matter the size of the company. It doesn't matter if you're large or small. Go to his website in the US and look at how that's ice cream brand on chase conversation in the US. So you don't need to be large, you don't need to have large budgets. In the case of Ben & Jerry's, for example, they do hire access to work staff with them, and they don't leave the job of joining the cultural conversation exclusively to market. I think too that you see brands that are much more about the progress they're making are the ones that are being successful. I think too, one of the things that's really critical is that it fit with your brand equity so that you really have a right to be in the conversation that you're in or that you're wanting to enter into. We've seen many brands, especially in the US, make statements, for example, around Black Lives Matter this year, and they've suffered backlash from it if, for example, diversity and inclusion has not been a big priority for them internally as a company. If their board are all white male, for example, do you really have should you really be making a statement on Black Lives Matter that's outward, or should there be things that you're looking at and addressing internally? So I think looking at your internal purpose, making sure that you have that woven through everything you're doing and it's truly embedded in your organization before going to join something. And then lastly, I think there are moments where brands are getting it really right and they are able to transcend from being a corporation in the conversation to really crossing the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, and really becoming a part of a big cultural conversation. And I think brands that can do that are the ones that are succeeding well too.
I think you're completely right, because what we've seen, if we look at 5-10 years back, what we've seen is that the trend was to donate part of funds to a social cause or something, whereas today it's being much more ingrained into what the company actually does. And I'm wondering whether that isn't also, so one thing is the trend that the companies are maturing on this agenda, but don't you also think it has something to do with the fact that consumers are also being much more adept to tuning into the difference between what we say we will do and what then we actually do? And if you don't do what you say you will do, if it doesn't ring true, then it will backfire on you.
Yes, absolutely. And in our research, actually, we were looking at if it's true that it really is the Gen Z and the millennials that are driving that and holding companies accountable. And actually, it was across all age demographics now that consumers really are expecting companies to do more. There was a makeup brand in the US that made a statement on Black Lives Matter. And there was a teenage girl with a Twitter account. And she gave them a rough time about the fact that their board of directors was all white male and that she still didn't see a place for herself on the shelf when she was reaching for makeup. And so, yes, consumers really are holding to account. And I think now in this age of social media and things moving lightning fast, everyone is their own broadcast channel. And so companies need to tread very carefully and what they're saying is something they've already about. I think, too, you make a really good point, and I feel quite strong about this. Of course, philanthropy is important. Of course, cause marketing is important. But those things are much less important than they've been before. The purpose here is not that you can be doing something, let's say, bad or extractive in one area, and then, go to a big awards dinner later in the year for how much good you've done and how much money you've given back somewhere. So it's really not about the philanthropic effort. It needs to be about business being both a force for its own growth, but a force for good in society. And so it's best done when that fits with your brand equity. One of the examples we talk about during the pandemic, a retail bank, for example, a retail bank could give money to its local community to pay for stockpiled PPE for hospitals and healthcare workers. And that would be a really worthy and nice thing to do. But what might fit better with their brand equity and what might resonate more with consumers themselves is if that bank is seen to be partnering with other banks to work on improving contactless payment options during the time of the pandemic. And so, it's not just about giving back, it's about saying exclusive to us that our brand equity can uniquely to this conversation that is going to both meet consumer needs and also the challenges and needs that the planet has. And so I think that trifecta is an important part too.
I think in reality what you're talking about is really zooming out, and we've been talking about this all day, luckily, zooming out and looking where could we fit in, where can we meaningfully help the system change that we all know is so hugely needed, basically. This actually brings me nicely into one of the other areas that I wanted to talk to you about, which is corporate activism, which is something that's becoming quite the buzzword here in Denmark, but has been growing more in the US over time. And I'd like to know from a US perspective, and for somebody who's a bit further along the corporate activism development, basically, how do you see that trend evolving? Is there something that we should learn from the mistakes that's already been made in the US and something we should learn from the successes that's been there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that corporate activism can take many faces. It doesn't always need to be something that's divisive. In the US, Nike did an ad when Cap, who had been taking a knee as a way of the societal injustice here in the US. and backlash here where people were burning their Nike sneakers because they didn't agree or believe in it. Fortunately for Nike, they also picked up a lot of new consumers along the way too. But I think that in your activism, you don't need to be antagonistic, and you don't need to be divisive. I look at Procter & Gamble, and honestly, I highly encourage folks to look at all the different ways that Procter & Gamble has been looking at societal and activist. It's like you might have lost me there for a minute.
We did lose you, Etienne, but I'm so glad you're back. I was panicking a little bit here, staring into the screen. We lost you at Procter & Gamble. Could you pick up from there? So you said, sure. Look at Procter & Gamble, and yeah. I don't know whether they have some competitors out there trying to kill what you're saying.
Right. No, and even when you think about Procter & Gamble, and for me it seems almost oxymoronic to say activism and Procter & Gamble in the same sentence. So, what they've done, and they've learned, they haven't been out there and got it right every time. If you look at what they did around with the Gillette brand, around toxic masculinity in the US, that got them a lot of backlash, and they learned that there really are nuances in the conversation. Fast forward now to later this year, they've already had several ads at a corporate level, which is so brave and so important that they're demonstrating this leadership. They've already had several ads around the racial injustice situation in the US and really showing what it's like from the perspective of being Black in America right now. And earlier this year, though, they were able to then advance that conversation because they'd already had several messages around it that felt safe to people, that weren't antagonistic. And so their message to folks this year, and it came out of the George Floyd murder, was around an appeal specifically to white people, for white people to step up and step out of their privilege. And it was it demanded something of you as an ad. And it absolutely didn't get them any pushback in the US at all because their nuance was just right. And what it also got was somebody quite famous heard that this ad was in development and actually called Mark Pritchard, the chief brand officer at Procter & Gamble, on his weekend. He answered a call that came up as an unidentified number on his phone on a Sunday afternoon, and it was Oprah. And Oprah had an opinion on this ad and this big statement that Procter & Gamble were going to announce in the US. And so I think that, again, is an example of that crossing the cultural zeitgeist. It's no longer just about you, the brand. It really is about the conversation that you want to be a part of and who in that culture is best placed to be in conversation with you. And just making sure that you really have the right to be there, saying what you want to say in that moment. We've had lots of brands approach us this year and say we want to do something. And the very first thing we say to them is, what are you doing internally before you go and make an external message on this?
Mm-hmm. So it's really, what I'm hearing you say is it's really about identifying what is my role in this conversation. Do I even have a right? Because some might not have a right to speak there. And how does it fit with what am I actually doing internally? And that makes me wonder how this actually differs from the purpose marketing that we've been pushing for so long. Like, find your purpose as a company, find out what it is that you want to do. How do you see the difference between those two different, I lost my English there. Those two different new concepts. Are they on a continuum, or are they conflicting? No.
Yeah. And by the way, gosh, I wish I could be fluent in 2 languages the way you are, so don't apologize for that at all, ever. I don't see them as 2 mutually exclusive or separate things. I don't see them as, purpose marketing, that's so 2019. Corporate activism, this is so 2021. I think that they are part of the same journey. And I think that actually the purpose marketing piece, I think brands having a purpose, and more so than brands, companies having a purpose, that is foundational. You really can't go out and claim to do any work to help move culture or society forward if you haven't first done this piece. So this really is the foundation. And I think when we talk about it as marketeers, it's very easy for us to say, it needs to be embedded through marketing. It doesn't just need to be embedded through marketing. Sustainability needs to be the first thing that design and innovation are thinking of when they're concepting and brainstorming and coming up with new ideas. This needs to be something, purpose is what will keep employees engaged and being more productive, especially now we're distributed workforces working remotely. So this really needs to be woven through all aspects of the company. And I think that there's a danger within some corporations now where they're making it so important and they're housing it within sustainability. I think it needs to be distributed throughout the company, and everyone needs to be rewarded when they do well and held accountable for the progress that the company should be making. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive, but I would warn anyone against embarking on corporate activism if you do not yet have your purpose house in order.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually something we've been hearing about all day, like how Ville said, well, for us to go out and be regenerative and offset all of the carbon emissions we've had historically, that means we need to have our house in order first and know what it is that we're going to do going forward and actually know exactly how we're going to get to zero on that. But I'm also thinking maybe in the Danish context, at least, when we see corporate activism, is often being put within the C-suite of the companies. So this is where that's for the leaders of the company basically to go out and do the corporate activism, and then you have the purpose and the sustainability and the transformation over here as something that the rest of the company is doing. Do you agree with that sort of layering it? Is that the same that you're seeing? Because you seem to be talking about corporate activism as something that's much more ingrained across different media channels, much more ingrained across everything that a company does, really.
I think that what we're seeing right now, and we're seeing this at a much larger societal level, before I answer your question about companies, I was in conversation the other day and came out with a phrase that others started writing down. It just came to me. I think what we're seeing is the democratization of heroics and heroism. So right now, Loa, when you're out in a grocery store shopping, you are dependent on the person in that aisle wearing a mask. And they are dependent on you wearing a mask. So right now we are all each other's hero, and we are all interconnected in ways that we have never had to be before. And I think what we're seeing in companies too is the same theme. It is not the job of C-suite to be the heroes or to save the company in some way. It is as much the job of the person working on the production line in the factory to be a hero for someone in the C-suite. And it is the job of the C-suite person to be a hero for whoever's on the production line. I do think we're all in this together. I think that has been one of the largest wake-up calls that we've had societally, and also it's pervading into our corporations too. So I don't see them as different. What I will say that I think is important, and in conversation recently with Mark Pritchard at Procter & Gamble, actually, talking about this Oprah phone call he got, I said to him, he was texting the creative in New York with changes on the script, and now he's taking a call from Oprah about this one ad. He's the chief brand officer of all of Procter & Gamble, and yet he is still there at the coalface. And what he said is, it's really important when it's an important societal piece, it's really important, or environmental piece, that senior people are involved. We can't delegate this to more junior, less experienced people. And so I think having that engagement from the C-suite all the way down into the day-to-day things we're doing is important. And I think we're seeing, certainly in the US, there's been lots of employee walkouts, tech walkouts amongst Silicon Valley tech companies, where employees are holding corporations to account. Employees are becoming activists within the organization. So your choice is, as C-suite, are you going to harness that drive and that energy, or are you going to try and resist it? And obviously you're going to have a better outcome if you can harness it. One last thing I want to say, it sort of goes back a little bit to the purpose conversation we were just having there in the corporate activism. Another theme that we are finding a lot in our conversations with brands is that there's another spectrum We have greenwashing. Everyone is familiar with what greenwashing is, when you are out there making claims and saying things that you really shouldn't be saying, and you are exaggerating, for example, or maybe hiding the mess you might have made somewhere. The other end of that spectrum, though, is what we call green hush. And there are many companies right now who are doing lots of great work, and they're being very quiet about it with their consumers, because they are working on the understanding that until they have their house 100% in order, that they really shouldn't say anything. And so I wanted to say, if there's anyone listening today that would find this useful, we've seen again and again that what consumers value most is authenticity over perfection. And so if you can go out there and say to them, this is the stuff that we've done, we're proud of, this is what we're still challenged by, and we're working on it, and these are our goals. It's really important. Consumers will be endeared towards your brand and be more loyal to your brand if you can let them know that maybe you haven't got it all figured out, but here's what you're planning to do. And so don't wait until all of your corporate sustainability goals, your 2030 goals are met, or you're going to meet them. Please do go out and share the good work that you're doing, because just like consumers, we can't do it all on one day, all at once. And so it's a journey, and consumers want to feel connected with brands' journeys too.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. This is what I've said, well, at least for the last 4 or 5 years, basically, that you really need to just be transparent about what you're doing. You don't need the full map about how you're going to get there, but you got to show that you're ambitious enough to want to move there. One of the other points that you were talking about made me think of this, I don't even know whether it's new, but for years and years, we've been talking about code of conduct and about how you would set certain contracts and push them down the supply chain and really just sign this and make sure that you move on this and that, so that we can make sure that this product is certified, and we need to make sure that you don't have child labor, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we will do audits to make sure that you, dear suppliers, holding up to the word that you said. And what we're seeing, and which for me has been really, really, really forceful here in the pandemic, is the other way that you can work with your suppliers, where you don't just say to them, this is what you have to do, and if you don't do well, I'm gonna move to somebody else, but instead said, we are in this in a partnership. This is a code of interdependence between you and me, and now we're in a pandemic, and this is really difficult, so I'm gonna buy stuff of you, I'm only gonna sell next year, and then you can hold on for it for me and finalize it, because that's the way I keep my company in business. Is this something that you're seeing too in the US and on a global scale with the brands that you're working with?
Absolutely. And we're seeing lots of companies, some companies got in the headlines for canceling orders, right? Mm-hmm. There's a famous fashion retailer based in Europe who got in trouble and had some bad headlines for that. And the flip side of it is all the companies that are doing the right thing and, where possible, really helping their supply chain. And I think that that sense of community that is being built through this pandemic is something that will serve us well as future challenges arrive. And so I think, yes, the story of separation is being rewritten right now. That story that we are all interconnected and interdependent is being reinforced. The story of separation between us and nature. We're seeing lots of folks taking to being out in nature during the pandemic, and so that story is changing too. So all these stories, and of course it's the Western individualistic, philosophy that's driven our economies and our businesses for many years now. And I think that the realization that as individuals, we won't get there. And so we all need to accept that we're in community with one another and embrace that. We're absolutely seeing that here too.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's also, what we're also seeing is when we're in this together, and we can't move it all independently as individuals. But what we do actually does make a difference. It does make a difference whether I request this certain product of the brand that I normally go to, and it does make a difference whether I make my voice heard on their social media channels and say, well, if you're talking about Black Lives Matters here, I was thinking when you were giving that example, it made me think of Aviate a Nation, who went into the Black Lives Matter campaign and immediately got backlash because all of their Instagram posts were all really skinny, white people on beaches where they're saying, where's the diversity in your own feed? Why are you even getting involved in this conversation? So I think the power of the individual, the power of the consumer is something that we really also as brands have to wrestle with going forward.
I think I absolutely agree with you. And the consumer voice, as I said, now everyone has a Twitter and an Instagram sort of channel of their own. They're all their own media companies, if you will, broadcasting messages. So I absolutely see that. Yeah, I think that the collaboration and the continuation of that trend of pre-competitive collaboration is something that we'll also see increasing. So within Brands for Good, for example, we do have brands that compete on shelf with one another. And they liken the way that they work to Olympic athletes who will often train in the Olympic Village together and even share coaches. Yet when they're on the starting blocks, they are there solely representing their company, their country, and wanting to win. And so we have brands pre-competitively collaborating on ways that you can message consumers and help empower consumers to drive this mainstream behavior change that we need to see. And they're very happy doing that, and they're completely comfortable that when they show up on shelf, they're still going to have a competitive advantage through their unique brand equity. So I think that's another trend that we're seeing of that collaboration continuing.
And I think that's really good, because one thing that I could fear that all of the listeners out there go out of this conversation with is, oh my God, if we get involved in anything societal, we're going to have a backlash. So let's just stay out of it, because I think that would be the wrong road to travel as well. Our time is almost up, Etienne. I'd like to just hear one last thing. How do you see the future? How do you see the power of the brand? Can we, through the brands, help transition in time?
Yes, great question. And of course, here I am doing this role, convening the brands together. So I absolutely do believe that we can. I do think it's going to take all of us with our different skill sets. I think everything that's being done on the supply chain side, everything that's being done through certification is still critically important. But there's something that we as a sustainability community have not addressed enough and have not given enough focus to, and that really is what happens with the consumer. And so, you think about if everyone's still washing in the US their clothes on hot, it doesn't matter what the company has done. It doesn't matter how they've re-engineered their laundry detergent. If we're all still washing with hot, that's on us as consumers. And so I think now more than ever, that focus needs to really be magnified. And so I think that brands getting together and pre-competitively collaborating, saying, how can we drive societal change? How can we drive environmental action? And how can we share when we do fall down? How can we share what we learned from that? And when we do succeed, how can we empower other brands to adopt similar successes? And so that very much gives me hope. Of course, from a scientific perspective, I don't know what we can change. I hope it's more, obviously we can't stop the warming that's coming. I'm hoping we can mitigate it and keep it, to the lowest of levels. And I think that, 10 years ago when I started working through the FSC with some of these same brands, I've seen CEOs change. I've seen sustainability departments increase. I've seen how the adoption of science-based targets is now being woven through their companies. And all of that gives me tremendous hope that the role that brands can play, just like everyone else who is doing their part, to help us get to where we need to be and mitigate against the crisis that's coming.
Thank you, Etienne. And now I have gotten hold of the iPad, which is the one that holds the one question from the audience that had the most vote. And I haven't actually had a chance to read it yet, so I'll read it out loud, and it's a bit long. One of the biggest challenges is to communicate a sustainable message about your product to the consumer in an effective and credible way when it has to be very short. Any recommendations? Okay, let me try. Do you get that? Because that was sort of stumbling. So basically, you got to communicate to your consumers, but you also got to make it really short. And it's about your product that's sustainable. What do you do?
Well, number one, I'm going to tell you to join Brands for Good, because we have a 4-hour workshop that will take you from 0 to 60 on just that. And you'll leave it knowing exactly the way to talk about it that's right for your brand equity and that matches with your consumer values. But short of that, do go on our website where we have the 9 most sustainable behaviors. We worked in conjunction with Project Drawdown and a climate psychologist, and we did qualitative and quantitative research to show what are the 9 most sustainable behaviors that brands and consumers can work on together. And this is just even looking at that will be a great way to filter what are those complex things that you have that you want to say. If we put them through the lens of this, there are simple ways that we can serve them up to consumers. And I would encourage anyone to truly be building that bridge between the sustainability department and the marketing department. What we've seen is that sustainability departments obviously know all of that complicated messaging, and marketeers are really great at changing behavior and endearing people towards messages, but they don't always have a lot of experience in taking sustainability messaging and making it simpler. So any activities that you can do to bridge those 2 departments together, and of course we have lots of tools in Brands for Good, and we'd love to share those with you. And I would say, know your consumer. I would say know your consumer and understand what their values are and meet them through the lens of their values. I think as a community, as sustainability and marketing professionals, we have spent the last decade or more really pushing sustainability on people. And we've done it with a currency, a coin that has 2 sides. One side is that you're more worthy if you do the right thing, and you'll get lots of validation on your social media channels for picking up trash or whatever glamorous green things you've done. And the other side of it is that we marketeers have made you feel guilty. So you feel guilty if you get the plastic straw, you feel guilty if you do the wrong thing. And so I think that it's time to stop pushing sustainability on your consumers. Go to your consumers, speak to them, understand what their values are, and instead create a pull to the more sustainable behavior. Those would be my last words on that.
And that was also very good words to have as last ones. I also think, if I can just add on that, I think if you get your customers used to sustainability being an ingrained part of your brand, it doesn't necessarily, first of all, have to be short, because you can just take it one piece at a time. We actually had one of the panelists earlier today saying, well, we've actually chosen to do a yearly wheel where we're going to talk about different parts of our sustainability on different times of the year, so that we can go more in depth with that one part of our sustainable journey and let that actually take up space then. And I also think that we shouldn't underestimate the knowledge that consumer has now about sustainability. You don't have to tell the story from the beginning. They get it already. So don't start from A. Assume that they're already at F or M or wherever your consumer group is likely to be. And don't be afraid to ask them to dive in more if they're interested in more. The more engaged consumers will look for you in podcasts and article series. Go to your website, watch videos on your websites where you spend 3-4 minutes talking about your sustainable journey. Don't be afraid to create that content too, because it also gives more depth to your message. So those would be my extra words.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the things we do that we're guilty of is when we go with our messaging is we articulate the problem, and we spend so much time kind of falling in love with the problem. What's happening to the forest? What's happening to everyone knows the bad news, so go to them with your good news.
Yeah. What are you going to do about it? Those kind of news.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for getting up early, Etienne, and getting online with us and sharing all of your knowledge. And I encourage everyone who's really interested in what Etienne is doing to go check out Brands for Good and see whether that could be something for you to join.